Hello guys, and welcome back to this new video. So today we are going to talk about the movement of the restoration of the Ten Commandments. We are in Uganda and we are in March 17th, 2000, when a few hundred members are found dead in a church. The amount of people who died in that church, who was set on fire, was around 300, and among them 78 were children. Later on, authorities found out also that there were so many other people stabbed and thrown in mass graves. The toll of dead people amounted in the end to 780. Why did we get to that point? To understand exactly the reason why we ended up in this sort of situation, we have to go back. We have to go back to, first of all, the general scenario. The general scenario that is Uganda in those years, right? Those years are in Uganda populated by apocalyptic millenarian sects. Sects that were more or less excommunicated by the Roman Catholic Church, not recognized as true movements of Catholicism, and they were all kind of like more or less violent. This one, the movement of the restoration of the Ten Commandments of God, was the least violent among those groups, although it ended the way it did. All of that was particularly evocative of the general context, which is the dictatorship by Idi Amin Dada, who died in 2003, and the context of the civil war that Uganda was experiencing at the time. But how did the movement of the restoration of the Ten Commandments born? Well, that's interesting. It didn't even born in Uganda. Its roots must be traced back to Rwanda. We are in Rwanda in the late 80s of the 20th century, when we encounter Speciosa Muktabana. We are in 1986 when Speciosa Muktabana decides to transfer, to move its movement and herself, a founder of this movement, based on apparitions of the Virgin Mary, to Uganda. So she decides to go from Rwanda to Uganda, specifically to Buya in Uganda. And what happens there is interesting. So she decides to transfer, and she is a seer. And then here she comes in contact with two different people, a father and a daughter. The father, Paul Kashaku, and the daughter, Credonia Muerinda. Credonia Muerinda has quite the past, meaning quite the sexually promiscuous past. And that comes in her support, because basically she's reproposing herself as Mary Magdalene, right? As the prostitute that gets saved by the word or the apparition of God. Paul Kashaku becomes one of the seer. Eventually, Paul Kashaku dies, and before dying, he has left basically all his power to a politician who has become somewhat a seer himself, and that person is Kibawutere. So at the death of Paul Kashaku, Kibawutere House was indeed the place of reunion. Eventually this place moves to Kanungu, which is where the church was located and where the massacre will happen. So the heart and the headquarters of this movement goes from his house to this place named Kanungu. And here the movement has a lot of momentum. Because also the themes were particularly interesting. So first of all, at this point, we are in the stage where everybody here is pretty much either suspended or excommunicated. The Church, the Roman Catholic Church, has not recognized this movement, however, people still believe it. And the messages here are eerie, to say at least. Of course, there are messages that the Virgin Mary delivers to exponents of this church, Kiberkutere, in the first place. And those messages concern number one, AIDS, which is the local plague at the time, and also the corruption of the Ugandan government. So they're very specific and very much addressing the Ugandan situation. So the movement starts basically imposing a bunch of rules for the restoration of the Ten Commandments. Number one, girls shouldn't be dressed with trousers. That's kind of like indecent according to this sect, and it is the sign of the corruption of the times, where you don't have any more gender, you don't have gender-specific roles, everything is mixed. So restoration of the Ten Commandments imposes also a certain dress code. Besides this though, that is quite, if you like, irrelevant. Most importantly, there are other prescriptions, like number one, sex must be avoided. Number two is people should rarely talk, because the more you talk, the more you're exposed to the risk of infringement of one of the Ten Commandments. So rarely talk. So there's the development here of secrecy around the sect. Of course, apparitions are tragic and catastrophic, apocalyptic in nature. So, for instance, great fire, blood rivers are seen, and of course, decapitated corpses. So, it's like the translation in an apparition of what was going on in Uganda. Now, the core of this is how the whole thing ended. Kibutere says to his disciples, listen guys, on December the 31st, the world is going to end. And probably they believed that. And probably they believed him. So they reunited to see the end. Yet, as we do know, the end of the world has not happened yet, and did not happen in that specific date. So, Kibutere reunites all of them, and we are in March 2000. Probably what has happened between December and March is that a whole category of traders has been born. Traders, why? Because of course people saw that the world did not end on that date. So they started, wanting their money back. Money that they had contributed to for the creation of the church and the creation and the spread of the message. And so category of traders probably was born. And those people were most likely the ones stabbed and thrown in mass graves. Then there was a small category of people, the believers, who were told to go to the church and attempt for a supernatural event. And probably among them, we have to admit that there must have been people who thought that actually suicide was the only escape from a doomed world. These three categories are not necessarily so specific of the Ugandan movement, but they are more general. They could be applied to this specific instance, but they are more general and they reflect more the different sects that end up in either mass suicides or huge mass homicide. And it's interesting how a country that is so plagued by war, civil war, terror, has a form of response in faith that is transformed from, let's say, something positive to something so violent and so tragic in its end, I would say. Interesting but not surprising, considering also what the message of at least the Old Testament was, right? So interpretation here is fundamental. Anyway, I thought this was an interesting episode that sure I didn't know before doing some research, and I ended up completely like by chance researching this. I stumbled upon this movement, but guys, I actually would want to know from you what you thought and what you think about this movement, and as usual we'll talk next time about something new. In the meantime, if you have enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Bye!